They pulled the backpack off her roughly at the base gate, hard enough that the strap burned across her shoulder and made her stumble, and a young woman in the dusty uniform, Private Riley Ward, had to throw out a hand to keep from falling as 3 military police grabbed her arms and shouted at her to stand still while a crowd of tired soldiers turning in from patrol slowed to watch, some smirking, some frowning. Nobody stepping in as the sergeant with a red face and shaved head held her. Pack up like a trophy and yelled, "What are you hiding, Ward?" And Riley's heart hammered because the one thing inside that bag that mattered was not the spare shirt or the broken radio parts, but the small gray drive wrapped in her extra socks. The drive she had crossed a ruined village to steal from a man who had begged her not to take it. The drive she had sworn to deliver straight to the senior officer who had sent her out at night with no witnesses and only 4 words of instruction. Trust no one. Not yet. Now the sergeant shook the backpack so hard that loose rounds, a metal cup, and a rolled-up T-shirt spilled onto the concrete, and when Riley jerked forward and shouted, "Stop! You'll break it!" he twisted her arm up between her shoulder blades and hissed in her ear, "Break what? Exactly." And his 2 corporals laughed, calling her little smuggler and hero girl. Because everyone on base knew she had dragged 2 bleeding soldiers back under fire last month, and some hated that story instead of respecting it, since her name kept coming up in mess hall talk when they wanted it to be their names instead. Riley bit down on a cry as pain shot through her arm and said, "Sergeant, you're damaging classified equipment. I have orders," but that only made him shove her against the gate post harder, yelling, "You don't give me orders, Ward. You don't have clearance for anything. You barely have the right to breathe near my gate." And a couple of the watching soldiers shook. Their heads yet did nothing, because it was easier to look away when someone else was a target, and the air smelled like oil and dust and hot metal. And Riley knew that each second that gray drive stayed in open sight was another second her mission might fail, another second the wrong person could decide it was theirs. The sergeant finally found it when the socks fell open on the ground and the small gray object rolled toward his boot. He stopped it with his toe, bent down, picked it up between 2 fingers, and held it up to the light with a slow grin, saying loudly so everyone could hear, well, what have we here?" And one of the corporals muttered, "Looks like tech gear, Sarge. Maybe she's selling intel to the locals." And the other snorted, "Or maybe it's her secret diary." And a few soldiers laughed. But Riley felt cold, because the man who had given it to her, a scared mechanic in a blown-out warehouse, had said that people in this very base would kill for it, that it held account files and shipment lists and messages from someone high up, someone who liked money more than uniforms. She had promised him protection and had none to give, except for the hope that the calm colonel with the gray hair and quiet eyes who had pulled her aside 2 nights ago in the mess hall would keep his word. When she brought the proof back, yet now she was pinned by 3 angry MPs who had no idea they were kicking around a bomb made of numbers and names instead of powder and steel. Before the sergeant could slip the drive into his own pocket, a voice cut through the noise, firm but not loud, the kind of voice people listened to even before they saw who spoke. "Sergeant Miller, drop the backpack and step away from the private." And the gate went strangely quiet as a tall officer in a green dress uniform walked up the road from the admin building, hat under his arm, medals neat on his chest, his face calm and unreadable. Riley stiffened because she recognized him at once. Colonel Victor Markov, the same officer who had sat across from her at a dark corner table in the mess hall, asking careful questions in a low voice and sliding her a folded note with those 4 words, the one man on base she was supposed to trust. Yet right now his eyes were cold as winter as they moved from the scattered contents on the ground to the sergeant's tight grip on her arm. And if he felt any hint of recognition, he did not show it. Sergeant Miller snapped to attention, still holding the drive between thumb and finger, and said, "Sir, we have reason to believe the private is smuggling unauthorized tech out of or into the base." "Sir," she refused to hand over her pack when ordered, and Riley opened her mouth to protest, then closed it as the colonel raised one hand for silence, his gaze resting on her face for a brief, unreadable second before he said, in the same even tone, "Private Ward, step forward." And the MPs loosened, their grip only enough for her to move. Her shoulder throbbed, her wrist stung, and she could feel everyone watching, waiting to see if she would shout, cry, or crumble. But she stood straight, swallowed her hurt, and said, "Sir, The contents of that device are for your eyes only, which drew a sharp scoff from Miller and a ripple of whispers from the group of soldiers at the side. Because who was she? A thin, dustcoat private, to talk like that to a full-bird colonel? The colonel's expression did not change. If anything, he grew even more unreadable as he turned his hand, palm up, toward the sergeant and said, "Drop your backpack for inspection." Now, the exact same words that had started this mess, only quiet and measured instead of shouted, and for a moment Riley's stomach dropped because she could not tell if he was repeating them to protect her or to make an example of her. Miller hesitated, then slowly placed the drive in the colonel's gloved hand and kicked the rest of Riley's gear into a rough pile, stepping back with an eager look on his face, like a dog waiting for praise after biting something. Colonel Markov studied the drive for a heartbeat that felt like a full minute, then looked at Riley again and asked, "Where did you get this?" And the base seemed to lean in closer around them, the rumble of trucks and distant generators fading in her ears. She remembered the mechanics shaking hands, the burnt-out vehicles around them, the smell of fear and smoke, and she remembered the colonel's earlier warning. And in that split second she made a choice, speaking clearly so everyone could. "Hey," from a man who said someone in this base has been selling fuel, ammo, and movement routes to our enemies, sir, and the silence that dropped afterward felt heavier than any shouted curse, because those were words no one said lightly. Miller's face turned a darker red as he barked. "Lies, sir. She's trying to distract us, probably covering for herself. We all know she was near that black market alley last week. I have witnesses," and Riley realized with a jolt that of course he did, because he had been there, drunk and loud with two other NCOs, waving money at a stall that sold more than fruit. She had walked past them on her way to the meeting point, helmet low, pretending not to see, and the thought flew through her mind that maybe this was all tangled together in ways she had not seen from down in the date. The colonel did not argue with the sergeant. He simply nodded once and said, "Corporal Reyes, Corporal Jin, collect everything from the ground and bring it to the inspection office. Sergeant Miller, accompany us. Private Ward, you will walk in front." And he turned on his heel and started toward the small concrete building beside the gate, leaving no room for debate. Riley bent to scoop up her spilled gear, aware of the eyes on her, aware that every button of her uniform was dusty and that there was a smear of dried blood, not hers, on her left sleeve that nobody had commented on, because right now everyone cared more about the drama than about where that blood came from. Inside the inspection office, the air was cooler and sharper, smelling of paper and metal filing cabinets. The colonel closed the door behind them, leaving the crowd outside, and for the first time since he had arrived his calm mask cracked just enough to show something like anger, not at her but at the room itself, at the idea of what might have been happening under his command. He sat behind the metal desk, placed the drive in the center, and said, "Sergeant Miller, step back from the private." And when Miller started to protest, he added, "That was not a suggestion," in a voice that froze the words in the sergeant's throat. Riley stood alone in the middle of the room, her backpack open on a chair, socks and gear spread out, feeling like someone had peeled away her skin and left only nerves. She braced herself for the colonel to question her in front of the NCOs, to cast doubt on her every word. But instead he looked straight at her and said in a tone just above a whisper, "Repeat the phrase I gave you when we last spoke." And her breath caught because that was the one thing she knew beyond doubt. This man had not forgotten her or their meeting. She answered at once, "Trust no one." "Not yet." And out of the corner of her eye she saw the sergeant's eyebrows jump as he realized there was a whole conversation he had never known about. The colonel nodded, then slid open a drawer, took out a small, locked tablet, and inserted the drive. The screen lit up with lines of numbers and names, shipment tags, and payment codes that meant nothing to Riley but seemed to mean a lot to him, because his jaw clenched and one hand curled slowly into a fist on top of the desk. He scrolled, then stopped and stared, the room so quiet that she could hear the hum of the air vent, before he turned the tablet so Miller could see and said, "Read the name on that last transfer." Miller leaned forward, his bravado flickering as he squinted at the screen, then went pale as chalk. Riley watched his lips move without sound, watched sweat bead along his hairline, and her stomach twisted, because she could guess what he was seeing. Not her name, but his, along with dates and amounts and notes about cargo redirected from convoys he had helped guard. When he finally spoke, his voice came out thin and shaky. "Sir, this can't be right. Someone is framing me, sir. I've never seen this account, I swear." But the colonel cut him off with a flat, "We will give you full opportunity to explain yourself to military investigators, Sergeant. For now, remove your sidearm and place it on the desk." Reyes and Jin shifted their weight. They had walked in thinking this was about catching a smug private and now stood frozen as the floor seemed to move under them. Miller's hand shook as he unbuckled his belt, set the pistol and radio on the table, then reached for Riley like he meant to grab her again, snarling, "You little snake, you set me up." But Reyes stepped between them, eyes wide, saying, "Sergeant, don't." And the colonel's voice snapped like a whip. "That is enough. Corporal Reyes, escort Sergeant Miller to holding. Corporal Jin, stay here." And suddenly the room was full of new motion as Reyes took the disgraced sergeant by the elbow and led him out, the man's curses fading down the hallway. When the door closed, Colonel Markov finally let out a long breath and, for the first time, allowed himself a small, tired smile in Riley's direction. It did not reach his eyes, which still held storm clouds, but it was the first sign he saw her as something other than a suspect, and he said quietly, "You did well, Private. You followed orders under pressure, and you did not break even when force was used," which made her throat ache more than any insult had, because she had not realized until that moment how badly she had needed someone to say she had done something right. She asked, "Sir, what happens now?" in a small voice, thinking of the mechanic who had trusted her, of the list of other names on that drive, of how many of them might be people in this very base whom she had eaten beside and trained beside. The colonel tapped the tablet and answered, "Now this base cleans house," and his tone was sharp again, steel wrapped in calm. "But that will not happen if certain people know how we obtained this evidence. If word spreads that you are working for me, those still involved will either run or try to silence you before we can act." The realization struck her with cold clarity. The danger was not over just because the sergeant had been led away. In some ways it had just begun. She swallowed and said, "So what do you need me to do?" And he looked at her for a long moment, as if measuring the weight he was about to place on her shoulders, then replied, "You will not be just a private sweeping floors and running errands anymore. As of this moment, you are reassigned to my staff as a liaison to internal security, effective when I sign the papers. Until then, outwardly, you will accept whatever rumors are already spreading outside, including that you were nearly arrested. Let them think you are weak, or lucky, or stupid. People speak freely around someone they underestimate." The idea of being seen as the foolish girl who almost went to jail made her cheeks burn, but she could taste the importance of what he was saying, and she nodded, even as fear crawled up her spine. She thought of the crowd outside the gate, of the way some faces had lit up with cruel excitement when the sergeant called her smuggler, and she knew that by nightfall the story would grow teeth and claws and race through the barracks. Riley Ward, caught with something in her pack, saved only because she played innocent. She asked, "Am I friends, sir?" "My platoon," and he shook his head once, slowly, answering, "For their safety and yours, you tell them nothing. If even one person guesses the truth, you might not live long enough to finish this work." A chill walked down her arms. She had expected to feel relief when someone finally believed her, but instead she felt the weight of a new, larger secret pressing on her chest. Yet there was also a strange, steady flame in her heart, the same one that had pushed her to crawl through gunfire to reach the wounded, the same one that had made her agree to meet a colonel alone in a corner of the mess hall when every instinct warned her to stay small and unseen. She straightened, gripping the strap of her empty backpack, and said, "Yes, sir, whatever you need," and he nodded, satisfied, then handed her the pack and added, "For now, return to your barracks. Show your bruises if you must. When people ask what happened, tell them the truth that hurts but not the truth that kills. Say the sergeant went too far and the colonel stopped him. They will believe that, and those who fear justice will wonder how much you saw." Riley slung the backpack onto her sore shoulder. Without the drive inside, it felt strangely light, but she knew it now carried something heavier than metal, a role she had not asked for. As she stepped out of the office into the bright yard, dozens of eyes swung toward her, hungry for drama. Some soldiers looked at her with pity, some with scorn, a few with quiet respect. Someone called out, "Ward, you off the hook or what?" And she forced a crooked smile and answered, "Guess the colonel. Decided I'm not worth the paperwork," which drew a wave of laughter that stung and yet hid the truth exactly as the colonel had planned. As she walked back toward the barracks, feeling bruises bloom under her uniform and whispers follow her like a second shadow, she passed the mechanic's name etched in her memory and silently promised him she would see this through, that the risk he had taken by handing her that drive would not be wasted on fear or pride. Up on the headquarters balcony, Colonel Markov watched her go, already calling in quiet favors, starting investigations, arranging transfers that would put certain officers under closer eyes, and he knew that the girl with the rough-handled backpack had just become the sharpest tool he had in a fight that would never make the news but could decide whether his soldiers died because of enemies in front of them or traitors behind them. That night, as the lights went out in the barracks and the low murmur of gossip faded into snores, Riley lay awake on her bunk, staring at the slats above her, listening to the faint hum of generators and the distant bark of a guard dog. Her arm ached where Miller had twisted it, but deeper than that ache was a hard, new resolve. Somewhere on base, the former sergeant sat alone in a holding cell, replaying every secret deal he had made, every name he had spoken in the dark, and somewhere else, a few unnamed men who shared his greed were still free, still dangerous, still unaware that the numbers they thought would hide them now glowed on a colonel's screen. In the dimness, Riley reached up and touched the canvas of her backpack hanging from the bedpost, remembering how powerless she had felt when they ripped it away and how quickly power had shifted when the right person saw the truth. And she understood that the bag had never been the real target. She had, and she still was. She closed her eyes, not to sleep but to picture what might come. Sudden accidents, friendly offers that were not really friendly, questions asked with too much interest by people who used to ignore her. She knew that tomorrow would not bring peace but more tension, new tests of whether she could pretend to be small while carrying something huge inside. And yet, instead of dread, a strange calm settled over her, echoing the colonel's own. If they came at her again, she would not just stand there and let them tear out a pack. She would be ready, not with weapons, but with knowledge of who was watching whom. As the first pale light of dawn crept through the narrow window, she whispered into the quiet, "Trust no one, not yet," then added words that were Hayes alone, but make them regret trusting greed, and with that vow hanging in the air like a drawn line, the day began, and somewhere beyond the fence, enemies waited in the hills while inside the base. Another war had just opened, one that would be fought in whispers and files and quiet orders, with a young woman and her scarred shoulders standing in the middle of it, no longer just the girl whose backpack got pulled, but the one who would decide who stayed, who fell, and who never saw her coming until it was far too late.